Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. My name is Stefano Albertini, I'm the director. I welcome you all here tonight for this evening that we organized with our friends at Salon Sanctuary. And it's a particular pleasure for us to have a chance to introduce this book, The Politics of Opera History from Monteverdi to Mozart, for a variety of reasons. First of all, as you know, this is a place where opera is constantly present. We talk about opera a lot. We have our series, Adventures in Italian Opera. We have constantly events that feature conductors, singers, directors. We have a series also of events that feature opera festivals that take place in Italy with the superintendent coming, presenting the new productions, and so on and so on. We even have a small opera club intended especially for students and younger people, meaning people who never had the chance to go see an opera. It's called Opera to the People. And Julian Sachs, who is there in the projection room, runs it. And what we do is that we invite them to come here. We offer them a pizza. Being students, they're normally starving, and that helps. And then we offer them 10 tickets to go see an opera at the Metropolitan that they have discussed at length together here at the Casa. So opera is really one of the pillars of our cultural program. At the same time, I find that the book that we are introducing tonight by Mitchell Cohen really helps us discover a part of opera that is not normally featured here. It's the glorious beginning of opera, when we normally talk more about the romantic and realist Verismo period, and so on and so forth. So much welcome, because it helps us understand a crucial time, and of course the very beginning of opera. And also because it comes with the perspective not of a musicologist, not of a musical philologist, but of an historian and of an historian of politics that brings to the understanding of opera his very own special, very precise, and very interesting approach. And I would like not to say anything else except from thanking colleagues, Professor Collins and Professor Banks, for being here with us. But I would leave the pleasure of introducing them more formally and to tell you something more to a dear friend and colleague in many, many enterprises. As you know, Salon Sanctuary is an organization that has the merit of bringing beautiful music to fantastic venues that are chosen specifically for the kind of music that is performed. The soul and the heart of Salon Sanctuary is here with us tonight. And you have heard her also several times here at the Casa. And what I appreciate immensely in the work that Jessica Gold does is not only her beautiful voice that makes me cry every time I listen to her. She moves me really. But it's the research that goes beyond the programs that Jessica proposes to her followers and our audience here in New York, in Florence together, and in many other parts of the world. Nothing that she does is by chance. Nothing that she does is chosen only because it's beautiful music. It's always part of a program that allow people to educate themselves on fundamental points of musical history and in general of European history. So for all these reasons, I'm very grateful to have an ally like Jessica Gold in the programs we organize and propose to the audience. So without further ado, I would like to please ask you to welcome very warmly the founder and executive director of Salon Sanctuary, Jessica Gold.
Mille grazie. Mille grazie, Stefano. Benvenuti. Oh, really? Ok, scusa. Sono abituata a cantare, non a essere sul palcoscenico per parlare. I'm used to singing, not speaking, so you'll have to excuse me a little bit. It's always an honor for us to be able to collaborate with Casa Italiana in whatever we do. The mission of Salon Sanctuary Concerts is to view history through the prism of music. And so when I saw Mitchell's book, I grabbed it and I pretty much devoured it because I felt that it spoke so much to what Salon Sanctuary had been doing for the 9 years of our existence, which is to seek out and be musical archaeologists, in a sense, to view the political and historical connections to music, and how music offers us a window on history and historical activity that we might not otherwise understand, even through reading historical texts. I am honored to have this event on our mini-series, which is actually called France Accord, which is about French music and political echoes with throughout 500 years of French music, from the 14th century to the age of Napoleon. We are honored to partner with NYU Maison Française, l'Église Française du Saint-Esprit, and the Church of Saint Jean-Baptiste in bringing a series of events. This is the one event at Casa Italiana, and Casa Italiana figures very prominently in our study of the history of French music, because after a certain point, French music was influenced profoundly by an Italian named Cardinal Mazarin, who was born in Pescara, Giulio Mazzarini, and he came to Paris and became the most powerful man in Paris. He tutored the Dauphin, Louis XIV, in statecraft, inspired by his lessons of Machiavelli. And it is ironic that an Italian, in a way, not only responsible for the trajectory of French music, but also for the age of French absolutism. And I know who can explain that better than I can is Mitchell and Eric. Thank you so much for joining us.
Is this okay? They working?
Hi, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for inviting us. This is such a great opportunity to talk about a really fascinating book, The Politics of Opera, History from Monteverdi to Mozart, and I'm really happy that Mitchell Cohen, who's also one of the fellows of the institute that I direct, can join us here tonight to talk about some of the main themes in the book. I'm not an opera specialist. I'm actually, I think, one of the people, I think this book is written for several different audiences, and I think it's an ideal one for someone like me, and I'm very interested to see what you have to say and what kind of questions you have also about the book. I think that it spans a great amount of time and covers a great bit of the evolution of opera up to Mozart, or just after Mozart. And it is very much a book that will be, I think, accompanied by a second book, as I understand it, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that. But the questions, that I'll have will probably be they may be a bit schematic, because I think that this volume is very ambitious. It's the sort of book that you return to with a lot of very specific questions and specific ideas that you want to explore. But its analysis of particular works of music is actually quite detailed, quite interesting, and it does, as Jessica said, offer quite a window into thinking about the relationship, very much writ large, of politics, and the fact that, as we imprinted in the first pages of the book, the real sense of the way that the emergence of opera takes place around the same time as the emergence of political thought and political theory, the modern theory of the state. So I think the best place to begin, it's always a question where you begin with a book as ambitious as this, is to begin at the beginning and to say, Mitchell, why don't you talk a little bit about the genesis of this project and what distinguishes it as a particular history of opera?
Okay. I think it's an interesting story. Before I begin it, let me though also chime in with my great thanks to Casa Italiana for hosting us this evening. Anyone who knows about opera knows no Italy, no opera, and the importance of the connection, and also to thank Jessica Gould and the Salon Sanctuary, who've been doing wonderful concerts and with the very interesting theme of Mazarin, who I'll talk about a little bit as we move along, and to thank Eric, who's been a wonderful director for an institute that's based here at NYU and enriches NYU and the city in which it's been my privilege to be a fellow of for a long time. So how did I start? How did this book begin? It begins with an Italian composer and a performance that I saw, not so surprising, but not a composer that I deal with in the book. Right. I really date this book to about 3.5 decades ago, to a performance I saw of Verdi's Don Carlos in Paris, the Italian version. Don Carlos had more than one version, first done in French. And as a student of political ideas and the history of political ideas, it struck me in many, many ways, not just because of Verdi's music, but because of the way it interacted with political themes that interested me. After all, here was an opera by an Italian composer, written for Paris, translated into, the first version of it is in French, but it's based on a play that's from late 18th century German, which is Schiller. And I thought this was a kind of wonderful cosmopolitan combination. And, but at the same time, some of the themes that came out, the first one and the way Verdi brought these out musically with characters, particularly by different types of voices, struck me a great deal. Again, it struck me as someone who's not a musicologist, right? I did have 2 years as a very bad second clarinet in the All Queens Junior High School Orchestra, which I promise you was an ensemble only parents could have enjoyed. Nonetheless, so one theme that grabbed me was the question of one character representing idealism, the Duke of Posa, and the King Philip. Now, I should add, I said 19th and 18th century. It's an opera set in the 16th century, although both Schiller and Verdi and his collaborators made all sorts of adjustments. And the themes that came out was partly the contrast between idealism and having ideals in politics versus realism, two different types of voices, which is a perennial question for a student of political thought. And then one of the other things that struck me was anachronism in the opera. Not just the type of liberalism that one of the characters articulates, which wouldn't have been a characteristic in the 16th century, but the issue of nationalism. Because if you know the opera, the Duke of Posa begins as a great advocate for shall we call it the national liberation of Flanders. But of course, the idea of national liberation is really not conceivable in the 16th century. Or nationalism, which is a word that develops at the end of the 18th century, even though the word nation exists long before, but with all sorts of other meanings that we're used to today. And so this set me about thinking about anachronism and the fruitful uses of it in theater, in this case with music. And most people I know have been first sucked into opera, which sort of takes you by storm if you become an opera fan, is usually the result of something that they encountered from, how shall I put it, opera's long 19th century, from Mozart basically to Puccini. And there are many changes in music, and there are changes in political ideas, and some of the operas are politically very interesting. Some of them have, how shall I put it, the problem, I like to call it the problem of the loopy libretto. And you still like the music. One of the things about Don Carlos is that the libretto, it's serious. So the question of how this all comes together and makes you think and respond to ideas and the operas differently became very important. But that issue of anachronism made me want to push myself back and try to understand the origins of opera and how it was situated, where it came from. Okay? I'm not the first person to have addressed any of this. There are lots of great scholars who've worked on all sorts of things. I just try to put it together in a certain way, which reflects my interest in politics and operas, and behind it are, well, I don't try to stress it throughout the entire book. I try to, there are a lot of basic questions that a student of the history of political ideas would emphasize. And one of them is beginning simply with the fact, as Eric mentioned, that opera itself is a product of the late Renaissance. Some people like to be very precise about its birth date, which is basically 1597 and 1600, because of experiments that are going on in Florence. And the first opera that we have both the music and the libretto to, because there's an earlier one where the music is missing, is Eurydice, which is done in Florence for a political event, which is the marriage of Maria de' Medici with Henri IV, Henry IV of France, and it was a political alliance. Henry didn't show up. He sent a substitute. He was busy fighting a war with his girlfriend, it seems. And the opera is very, very interesting, and it's politically interesting. And some of the content of it is interesting. And the way it's structured comes out of a whole debate, which we can get to on what the relationship between music and words. Particularly focused on the idea of monody. It's believed that one of the people in the audience, as part of the suite from Mantua, and the performance was in a room at the Pitti Palace, was Monteverdi, who 7 years later will produce an Orfeo for Mantua, which is probably the first truly great opera. So that the fact that I became interested in the question of anachronism pushed me back to studying this earlier period, trying to understand the intersection between politics and history and this what was becoming a new art form. And then as I do in the book, it took me to first to Florence and then to Mantua, then to Venice, which is the second half of Monteverdi's career, where the incarnation of Poppea, which is probably the first great political opera, although all the others have political themes in them, is written and performed. And then I moved over to France in the 17th century, where opera begins very significantly thanks to the Italian influence. Mazarin, who's the subject or provides the framework for Jessica's events, and then of course Lully, who is the first great French composer, but he's really from Florence, right? And so then dealing with France, culminating in a way in a conflict between Rameau, who's the 18th century's great French composer, and Rousseau, the Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss-born, very famous political philosopher, who actually arrived in Paris as a music copyist and looking for a career, and who wrote operas, which I've heard. They were very popular. One of them in particular was enormously popular. And then finally to Vienna, both in the form of Metastasio, the librettist, the Caesarean poet, as they called him, and then, of course, Mozart. Let me make one more point before I turn back to Eric, and that is, as someone who starts from the study of political ideas, the one thing I'm not trying to say in the book is that everything about opera is political. It's just my take because of the area that I work on. There is a tendency in some academic, intellectual domains to imagine that absolutely everything about anything concerning art or artwork or music or anything else is completely political. I think as in life, not everything is political. But I come out of the study of politics, so if I have a contribution to make, that's where I emphasize it. And there's one last thing. Working on the other reason for working on a book like this is that it meant I had to go to the opera for work. Yeah.
Well, tax season's coming up, so you can. It's really nice to see what you can do with that. You know, one of the things that I think in your saying that, I mean, that you're not making the argument. You know, you're not making this sort of argument about a certain kind of place of politics in opera and politics, I guess is the other way to put it. But you are trying to, I think, listen for politics throughout the history of opera with these, specific sites that occur in the book. I think we're going to focus, for the most part, given the occasion of the series, on the first 2/3, I think, of the book, sure. And we may talk a little bit about Mozart at the end. But I want to start by asking about listening for politics at the beginning of opera. You have a chapter that's titled "Who Rules," and it's very much related to one of the two political figures who cast the longest shadows of the book, being Machiavelli and Rousseau. How do you hear politics in those early operas, and particularly in the context of Florence?
Right.
Before we get to Monteverdi.
So the emphasis on Machiavelli didn't write operas; he did write plays, but for students of the history of political ideas, Machiavelli, when he writes The Prince, it's 1513. He's in retirement, forced retirement, because political reality had imposed some things on him. But he captures the emergence of modern politics in a way that's absolutely urgent and special and important, by thinking of politics, first of all, largely in a secular way, in terms of the organization of power, and the question of the development of modern politics. Listen, the word modern is a tremendously fraught term, and arguments over what modern means it's by no means simple. But his importance in this is the shadow that he casts is correct in capturing a big movement that's going on historically toward the creation of central power over territories, and trying to understand politics as an economy of power and violence tied to that, and if you teach political theory, as I do, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me when I started looking at the early operas in Florence and the debates that led to them was the centrality of, obviously, of what's called monody, in which, let me broaden the canvas a little. You have debates in circles in Florence in the late 16th century, men of the Renaissance. So one of the things they're doing is thinking about about ancient music, of which they have virtually none. But they can read what Aristotle and Plato and other ancients write about it. And among these circles, Camerata, most famously the one around a fellow named Bardi. One of them includes Vincenzo Galilei, the father of a certain scientist. And the argument becomes the intellectual exchange is an intellectual exchange over who rules, music or words. If you are a student of politics, the phrase "who rules" is also just jumps out at you. I named the chapter that. That's why I called it. But the issue, which you'll find all the way back to Aristotle, and in this case, the issue, as words or music, if you think of monody, which is essentially a single voice line with accompaniment, in contrast to polyphony, the most popular form of secular music at the time being polyphonic madrigals, in which you have layers of voice, one on top of the other, which creates its fun and its beauty, etc., but you really don't get the words. And so the issue becomes one of making the word music becoming functionally a way of enhancing ideas and emotions and what might be expressed. And if you read Vincenzo's dialogue on ancient and modern music, ancient music for him was Athens, modern was madrigals, or Bardi, or a man named May, who is a philologist in Rome of Florentine origins. You can see what the argument is about. Let me just, if I might, if I can find it, read you a quick passage from May, which I think gives a really good sense of it. So this is this early philologist who has such an important influence on this debate. Nature gave the voice expressly to man, not so that he might, with its pure sound, like animals which lack reason, express pleasures and pain, but so that together with meaningful speech, he might suitably express the thought of his mind. And so you have, with that thought in mind, you have conversations that lead to the first experiments that become opera. One other thing that's very important going on at this time, a rekindling of interest in Seneca, the Roman philosopher who was an advisor to Nero, who ends up being a central character in the coronation of Poppaea, and an enormous new interest in Tacitus, the Roman historian, who in many ways, because Machiavelli is banned, his writings are banned, Tacitus also becomes a type of substitute, because there are lots of similarities in his thinking. And when Monteverdi ends up writing the coronation of Poppaea for Venice, his librettist, Bucinello, who's a very remarkable figure, 1642, 1643 is the period for this opera. He uses ancient Roman historians as his sources, of course, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio-Cassius. But if you look at the opera, the use of history is almost as distant from what we know about ancient Roman history as the character Don Carlos in the Verdi opera is from this 16th century.
That's one of the things that's interesting about just this eternal recurrence of the question of sound versus text, language versus music, but also this kind of quarrel between the ancients and the moderns that recurs again and again in these debates. To be anachronistic ourselves for just a second, we tend to think of that in the debate between the ancients and the moderns always win out, and there's a way to write this. I think that you're just, without really trying to, it's easy to put your finger on the scales. Was this a very robust debate? I mean, the representatives of the sides of the ancients are they also brought into this kind of an interesting circulation with the kinds of people I think we think of as making a sort of more the argument that leads us to an understanding of early opera and monody in particular?
Yeah, the point I was making about monody was because of a type of parallel that came into my head about the way modern politics emerges with a central voice. In Florence, the central voice is the Duke. The people having these conversations are all mostly aristocrat nobility who don't have much political power, and many of them are in service to the Duke. One of the interesting things about, let's just stay with Italy for a moment. The movement of opera from Florence. Florence is then run by the Medici, so it's a duke who's in charge. The aristocrats don't have any real power. A little bit like the early world of Augustus that Tacitus is looking at. Then you go to Mantua. It's also the Gonzaga family, which is where Monteverdi's career really begins to take off with Orfeo, and he did a second opera there called Ariana, where all the music except for one lament is missing. Anyone finds it, I'll take you to dinner anywhere. But then after getting fired, he's going to move to Venice, which is an aristocratic commercial republic. And so if opera begins as a type of political event or something used for a political event, after these intellectual conversations in Florence, it's also used as an aristocratic entertainment or in the ducal world in Mantua. And that changes. In Venice, and in fact you have the first commercial opera houses there. Venice is in a unique situation, of course, because you also have 50,000 people come in at carnival time. So you have audiences, plus the people behind the intellectuals behind power in Florence, particularly a group called the Accademia degli Incogniti. Forgive my accent, I'm still working on my English. Are people that Monteverdi chooses his librettists from. One of the things that's interesting about him is truly the first great composer of opera, is the people he chooses as librettists or whom he interacts with. He doesn't simply choose them. But the Orfeo of Monteverdi, Strigio, the younger, who is his librettist, later becomes the chancellor of Mantua. Right? And I won't go through all of them. His second librettist for the Ariana is actually Rinuccini, who has written the operas for Florence. And then Bussanello is part of this circle. Bussanello's an amazingly interesting figure whom not enough has been written about. So,
well, hitting once again on that prospect of the anachronism, one of the first Monteverdi operas that you write about is another figure. Is Orpheus. It's a tale that also trails through the book along with Ovid. Why is that such an important
theme
in early opera? I mean, you even, I think, begin with this in the happy ending version of Orpheus in Florence.
In Florence, yeah.
But you might talk about it also in the Mantuan environment.
Right. It seems to me that the theme of Orpheus is, for various reasons. First of all, there's the huge influence of Ovid. And I have to say that having to reread him for my book was just a glorious experience. But many things in the Metamorphoses are used, many of the myths from there are used in early operas. One of the interesting changes with the coronation of Poppaea is that here Busanello and Monteverdi use a historical moment rather than myth, rather than Orpheus and Ariana or Ulysses in his first opera for Venice in 1640. So one is just the enormous popularity, but Orpheus is also in a way not a lot of people have said this, is the first hero of music in many ways, right? And it's protagonist, and so in a way he naturally is attractive, and there are other theatrical and poetic Orpheuses before the 1600 Eurydice, which is by Rinuccini and Jacopo Peri, with some additions by others. But notice the point that Eric made. It has a happy ending. Now, actually, there are some ancient versions that have a happier ending. But here, there was also a simple question. It was a political marriage. The production was a present to Maria de' Medici. So Eurydice gets out in the end. They have a happy ending, right? And I suspect that it probably wouldn't have been a good idea to have this particular story for a political opera in Florence, where the bride is still in hell at the end, right? So that's something. But there's something else which I can't really pin down. This is me speculating, but I actually try to speculate about it in the book. And if you accept the idea I had about modern politics, one of the central themes in Orpheus is borders, right? And borders were being recreated, redrawn, and it doesn't. I won't find a letter where Rinuccini says I was sitting here thinking of borders or Strigio, although Strigio, given his political background, would have thought about these things, but not that I put it in it. There's a way in which there's something in the times that gets gelled, at least I think. And so I think that's also an important factor. And then the other question is, Orpheus is a young prince, right? And what does he learn? And where does he fail? Right? And what's the consequence of that? If you jump from there, by the way, to the Magic Flute, you'll see two sorts of bookends for me, right? Because there also you have something like that.
Well, you give us a really strong sense too of how versatile as a stylist and as someone responding to the times, at least in the picture that we have of him in your book, Monteverdi is. And I think even that distance between the Mantuan Monteverdi and the Venetian Monteverdi, the Monteverdi of the Coronation of Poppaea is really, really powerful. And I don't think I had quite appreciated how odd the ending of the Coronation of Poppaea actually is.
Yeah, I think it's...
and putting it in a political context
right.
is really fascinating.
It's one of the things I liked about Don Carlos is that in fact the ending is ambiguous. You don't know quite what really is happening there. And I think because we're dealing with artworks connected to politics rather than political pamphlets, I like ambiguity. So what he's referring to is, I suppose most people, well, just in case you're not familiar with Coronation of Poppaea.
Are most of you familiar with the
So it's Monteverdi's last opera. It's Nero is emperor, and he's decided to throw out his empress, Octavia, And that creates the center of the opera. By the time you get to the opera, and Nero, of course, is a rather nasty figure. So at the end of the opera, it seems that his love for Poppaea has triumphed. And there's a famous duet, shall we call it, Portimiro of Poppaea and Nero singing how they adore each other. It's one of the, if you've never heard it, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. But two things. First of all, scholars are not sure, that tend to doubt that Monteverdi actually wrote this last piece of music. And they think it was really written for a revival 2 or 3 years later, but it's not clear. It's not in all the early librettos. The one I looked at one at the National Library of France, in fact, from the 1645 production, and it's not there. It was a printed libretto that was handed out at the original performances. And so it's this really beautiful cooing back and forth, which you would think at first doesn't make sense, given all the nastiness that you've seen throughout the opera. And all the figures who were in some way admirable in it, whether it's, I won't go through the whole list, but they're all dead or in exile in the end, right? And although the portrait of Seneca is quite complicated. So what does it mean that to have this extraordinarily beautiful thing with these two fairly dreadful people singing of their love at the end of the whole thing, and that cynicism to me, sort of, to me, it forces me to think about the whole opera and all the politics in it, rather than coming up with a simple formulaic ending to it. But let me go, because one of the issues that kept coming to me, and it also dealt with the French, but it's with all of it, is the sort of tension between what I would call an interpreter's hubris. It's one of the reasons that anachronism became such an issue for me. The question of do I impose my interpretations of today on something that's written back then? What's written back then is not exactly completely written in stone, because a lot of these things changed in performances. So I worried about that, and that's one of the reasons I sought to situate all these ideas historically. At the same time, there are moments where some of it is astoundingly fresh, right? And so the tension between the historical reality of of the way these ideas and the music and all of it came together, and the tension between that and the fact that the ideas and some of it seems so remarkably present, is a tension that I think is actually quite fruitful, but it's something that I lived with constantly while writing the book. I'd like to give an example of it from Poppaea. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. I don't want to ruin your evening. But there's a remarkable scene where Nero comes in and announces to Seneca, my master, Seneca is his teacher, I've decided to throw her out because I want Poppaea. And then the conversation between them, of course later on in the opera he's going to order Seneca's death. The conversation between them, besides being extraordinarily present, it's really about the relationship between emotion and reason in politics and in rulership. Let me just read you a few lines. So it goes back and forth between, it's the 9th scene in the first act. So Seneca says to Nero, "Passions make mischievous counselors, for they hate law and reason they despise." Nero says, "No, law is for those who serve. But if I so wish, I can abolish the old and introduce the new. Rule is divided. Heaven belongs to Jove, but in the world below, my scepter rules. Seneca says, will, if uncontrolled, is not true will, but with your permission, only madness. Nero says, reason imposes a harsh discipline on those who serve, but no, not on those who command. Seneca says, on the contrary, irrational command destroys obedience. Nero says, I'll do as I like. Seneca says, don't upset the people in the Senate. Nero says, I care nothing for the Senate and the people. Seneca says, care at least for yourself and your good name. Nero says, if anyone reviles me, I shall tear out his tongue. Seneca says, the more you silence them, the more they'll speak. And Nero then adds, right will always side with might. I won't go into further. Just to come to the end of the scene, Seneca says, rulers should be guiltless or guilty only of illustrious wrongs. Nero finally says to him, get out of my sight, impertinent teacher, insolent philosopher. And Seneca says, the poorest argument is bound to win when power contends with reason. I rereading that the other day, I was sort of astonished by it. I should just mention in passing that I reread the chapter of Suetonius on Nero, and he has a list of Nero's characteristics, one of which is that he's blonde.
Well, that's certainly timely. And actually, speaking of timely, I mean, there has been, I think, recently a kind of reinterest in Monteverdi. Yeah. There's a resurgence, I think, in productions, and particularly in the last couple of years in New York. I mean, do you think about that in relationship to this?
To the last, but it was his 450th anniversary, yeah. So that has helped stimulate.
I think explains it more.
And he's come back, and there's been a lot of good scholarship. Ellen Rosand at Yale has done some terrific scholarship, and there are a number of people, and I am indebted to all this scholarship in my book. But Orfeo or the Return of Ulysses to his homeland, or the Coronation. To me, both they raise interesting historical questions and interesting questions in the history of political ideas, and then they're also astonishingly fresh. And so at times I came to question my own criticism of the idea of an interpreter's hubris, but partly that's a reaction against sometimes you read reviews where the reviewer of a production is only concerned with imposing their ideas from their time, and without the sort of tension that I think there ought to be. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so. And I mean, the other transposition, and not so much in time, but in place that occurs in your book. I mean, the book is really kind of in three parts, right. And you sort of shift sites from Italy to France at a sort of key moment. How does, and certainly Mazarin is a figure that you'll be investigating further in the next session. Mazarin is this key figure for bringing opera to France. What are the politics of that moment? What do they look like to you?
First of all, the politics of Europe as a whole in the first half of the 17th century is brutal and the mess. 30 Years' War, for example, which is probably the worst event on the European continent, certainly up until then, right? And it's bloody and it's a mess, and you have a competition between Spain and France, and in fact, one of the great changes is sort of the flip, where at the beginning of the century, Spain is dominant. By the time you get through Richelieu and Mazarin, it's France is emerging as dominant. Richelieu Mazarin's teacher and predecessor, plays a very critical role in forming the modern French state. And he's also acutely aware of the importance of artistic show as an exhibition of power. And so is Mazarin. In fact, let's see if I have it somewhere. Yeah, this is a quote I found the other day in Montesquieu, 18th century. But he says, the magnificence and splendor which surround kings form part of their power. Right? And so Mazarin, as a pupil of Richelieu, becomes first minister of France. With the death of Richelieu, but with King Louis XIV, a toddler still, well, not quite, but and so there's a sort of joint rulership in a way between Mazarin and Anne of Austria, who's Louis XIII's queen and queen regent, and Mazarin is a great appreciator of opera in its early forms. In fact, he knows those early works. He knows the Eurydice. He knows Monteverdi. I was never able to quite find it, but during the siege of Mantua in the late 1620s, Strigio is the chancellor, and Mazarin is a diplomat for the other side. And I sort of imagined there'd be probably only 30 people are really interested in it, but there might be a great opera of having them meet. But he knew about this, and in Rome, and the origins of opera in Rome, and not quite the origins, but under the Barberini family, who had several popes, one of whom wrote librettos. You have a great interest of opera in Rome, but of course they're not themes like Orpheus or Nero. They tend to be on sacred themes. Not all of them, but and one of the things that Mazarin does is he brings a fellow named Luigi Rossi from Rome to through Florence to Paris, and has him writing operas. His Orfeo is really quite. I like it a lot. People at the time didn't. Mazarin wasn't that successful in it. The response wasn't great, and you have a type of. If you read literature from the time, there's a type of annoyance that the two people ruling France have accents. Anne of Austria is really from Spain, and Mazarin always had an Italian accent in French. And there's a lot of anti-Italian prejudice that goes throughout the entire period in France. And it gets expressed at moments during the Fronde, the aristocratic rebellion. Mazarin's rule is sort of a culmination of Richelieu, but then absolutism breaks down and it's crushed again, and it's a question of establishing what Louis XIV becomes. And but so music becomes very important in that. But the other crucial figure, whom at least according to a number of stories I read, went to a performance, snuck into a performance of that Orfeo, was a young fellow from Florence named Lully, right? Who of course changes his name from L-U-L-L-I to L-U, from L-U-L-L-I to L-U-L-L-Y, and he also switches political sides after that aristocratic revolt called the Fronde, and really becomes the founder of French opera. And his operas they're pretty good. They're interesting, and there are interesting debates about them, but he sort of gets the patent from the king and if you read critics, or if you read someone like D'Alembert in 18th century France, they say that he's able somehow to get the to musicalize the rhythms and syntax of French in a way that someone hadn't done before. Mm-hmm. So the origins of opera in France are deeply tied to Italy, and also to the accommodation by the French language of
particular musical form, which we're going to run out of little time here, and I want to make sure that we've got time for questions, but I do want to sort of jump ahead to talk about, to ask you about the most notorious figure from French political thought who becomes involved in these debates about the use of the French language in opera, and that's Rousseau.
Right.
And I think the second figure really shadows over the book all the way through your writing about Mozart.
Right. So Rousseau's relationship to music is quite remarkable, and always amusing. He arrives in Paris from Geneva as a music copyist. He tries to invent a new form of music notation. He's trying to write music and write operas. If you read his autobiography, his Confessions, you'll find that he serves for a little while in the French diplomatic mission in Venice, and he's really not so interested in politics. He's interested in the music around him. He's not a great composer. And he ends up in this all-out intellectual battle with Rameau, who's really the greatest French composer of the 18th century, and whose works are quite, I love them. And it's a complicated argument. It becomes an argument about the priority of whether harmony is prior to melody or melody is prior to harmony.
Mm-hmm.
One being, if you think about the way music looks across a page, a chord moves vertically, the melody moves horizontally, and one can think of it in terms of a structure of the universe versus Rousseau's romantic individual desires. Now I'm interpreting, and they have a fierce exchange, and part of it is also over the question of language and opera. So Rousseau, who's most famous for that famous line, "Man is born free, everywhere he's in chains," later is involved in quarrels about music. Some of them pretty funny. Partly because Rameau, whose book on harmony is still read these days, is a great composer. He's a kind of wooden writer. You don't want to get into a polemic in French with Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but Rousseau is not a great writer. I mean, he's a great writer, but not a great composer. Their conflict is a little bit like Wagner and Nietzsche.
Yeah.
You know, Wagner wanted to be a great philosopher. He's not a very good philosopher. He's a great composer. And Nietzsche, I may not have sat through some of Nietzsche's piano music. It's sort of nice, but he's an important philosopher. And so you have a big event, in fact, at the Paris Opera in 1572, where one of Lully's operas is presented. It's Lully's last opera. He's dead, but there was a return to it, Assis Égalité. And it's very typically Lully. It's very structured. You have gods. You have the original version had a homage to the Dauphin, and things like that. And that one night in Paris, instead of the usual beginning, they put in a short Italian opera called La Serva Padrona by Pergolesi, which is funny and melodious and is about a maid who takes over the household and marries the head of the household and basically turns an emerging bourgeois marriage and world upside down. This one evening leads to arguments and debates. There are 900 pages of pamphlets by every person you'd associate in the French Enlightenment. God knows, because I've read most of them. And a lot of it dwells on what is opera, Italian versus French opera. And Rousseau writes a letter on French opera, where basically on French music, where he basically says the French language can't do opera. Mm-hmm. And what does he do the next year? He writes an opera in French.
The opera. Right.
It's called Le Divan Do Village. It was premiered at Fontainebleau. And you should hear it once or twice. You want to hear it. But it was perhaps the most popular French opera of the late 18th century. It's amusing.
We should before we sort of wind this up and open it up to question, we should point out that there was a great parody written of it by
Right. After Rousseau's opera came out, there was a parody written first in France, and then it was transferred to Austria, and a certain 13-year-old wrote a parody of it, the musical parody of it, and it's called Bastien. In Rousseau's opera, there's Colin and Colette, and sometimes just go on to YouTube and put in Divan Du Village by Rousseau, listen to his overture, and then listen to Mozart's The 12-Year-Old's overture. It's, besides the fact you'll hear a theme that somehow ended up in the Beethoven's third, and I don't know how, because I don't think Beethoven ever heard it. But anyway.
I want to open this up and see if people have any questions or things that they would like to explore. And I feel like one of the things that we probably did not speak enough about were the particularly Rousseauvian ideas that permeate so much of French opera of the period, and from Les Ingalants to this sort of nature versus culture question that really seems to be percolating. You even talk about, I think, the Indiscreet Jewels, the great strange novella by Diderot in that context, which is very, very, very funny novella. I remember editing a version of that for a zone reader back in the 80s, the Libertine Reader, and it was one of my favorite texts to be introduced to. But
besides the fight between Rameau and Rousseau, there's a constant fight between supporters of Lully and supporters of Rameau, and some of it can wear on you, but some of it's very funny.
Well, and you also, in really working through what it means to kind of listen for the politics in a certain way, and listen whether that's political theory, but also the kind of pressure that political existence, I think, exerts on anyone who's alive and appear, but particularly composers. That in a lot of ways you're in a real different sort of labyrinth than you find yourself probably if you're thinking about opera at other periods. And I'm just curious if you want to. I'm maybe being a bit presumptuous here to talk about thinking about what I assume is going to be the next volume. But how has this affected your way of thinking about the task at hand in writing about Wagner in the 19th century?
The book I'm writing now is a very different kettle of fish. Although again, one of the things that I'm trying to do is deeply contextualize.
Mm-hmm.
The political ideas one finds in Wagner, which are several. Anarchism at one point, humanism at one point, especially after the revolution of 1848, a vicious anti-Semitism, a federalism. He's never in favor of a strongly centralized state. To use an anachronistic word from the 20th century, there's something totalitarian about him in his cultural attitudes, but not in his political attitudes, because he never wants a centralized. He wants Germany to be unified, but he's never in love with the idea of a strong centralized state, partly because he hated Paris as the center of politics and culture. So it's a shift. It's not trying to cover as many places and such a broad period of time, because it'll go from Wagner's birth till he dies actually in Venice in 1883, and trying to see the ideas, which I find in all of his operas, not all the same ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Very contextualized in terms of the questions I ask are questions of what are the actual debates going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't only think of things, when you read a lot of things on Wagner and politics, you always find people focusing on the speech that Wagner gave in June 1848 to something called the Vaterlandsverein, the Patriotic Circle is how it's usually translated, which was a major democratic Republican organization in Saxony. And Wagner joined its more radical wing. But usually people look at this famous speech he gave, they try to interpret his politics in light of the speech without first asking, what was the Vaterlandsverein? What was the politics in Saxony?
Mm-hmm.
Why would someone like him have joined it? So I'm trying to pose different questions, but also like Mozart and perhaps one day Monteverdi, there's so much written about about Wagner that every time you think that you've come up with something original, you can't possibly know because no mortal can read everything that's been written on Wagner or Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
So
why don't we see if anyone has any questions or comments?
Early music singers and opera singers are familiar with the debate between us that's very much like some of the philosophical debates that you discussed between small voices and big voices,
Mm-hmm.
and the evolution of not only the voice but the orchestral instrument as going from something for an intimate space to something for a huge space. And can you discuss that in the context of the fall of the Ancien regime and opera becoming, not to start a Bible, but that opera becomes a popular art form after a certain point, and that the houses have to become bigger to allow more people in, and how does that change the aesthetic and the construction of the instruments and what's demanded of the human voice itself?
the construction of instruments, you should ask a musicologist. One point is the point that I made about the change from Mantua from Florence to Mantua to Venice. With you have to, and there's literature.
It's already prefigured.
Like in Roseanne's book on 17th century Venetian opera, where if you want to fill up the house, you may have to be more concerned with pyrotechnics in the theater, also in terms of staging and appearance, than the sheer power of what a Monteverdi and a Busanello do together. But Cavalli also did, I think. So there can be music that's great fun, but it doesn't quite have the profundity of interconnection, because Monteverdi is really inventing ways of representing voice musically in relationship to attitudes and feelings. That scene that I read to you about Nero and Seneca, so Nero is played, of course, by would be played by a castrato or a mezzo or a countertenor, but the way Monteverdi constructs the differences in voice is critical. Seneca's deep bass tones, reason, but even at a certain points, you suddenly hear plucking of strings in his voice, which is how Nero's voice is going most of the time. And so Monteverdi constructs musically the argument. And I suppose one could go through a whole series of operas and look how political arguments are, especially in Face on Face, I think of Catone and Utica by Metastasio, Caesar and Cato facing off, the same thing in Don Carlo, right? When Posa and the king talk, or when the king and the Inquisitor talk. So, but in terms of popularity, bigger audiences really begin later 18th century, and then especially more in Italy. Then.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of questions now. Yes.
You mentioned the anachronism in Don Carlo about the Cleander and Verbetto. What about the last scene of Don Carlo?
Yeah.
When Don Carlo takes refuge with his grandfather, too. What is the political meaning?
Well, I think he doesn't take refuge. He's pulled in, right? And you're not quite sure who it is pulling him in. So that's part of something that I saw a production about 5 years ago in Paris that drove me crazy at the end, because Philip just orders a bunch of soldiers to kill Don Carlos, right? And to me that ruined the end of it. I think forcing people to feel ambiguously about some of what they've seen and what the final meaning of it. The end of that opera? The king is still in power. The idealist, which is Posa, is quite dead. And what exactly is happening to Don Carlos? And so I like that. It's like for the same reason that I like Popea with that ending. That makes, so after all this dreadful stuff goes on, Nero is happy and singing, Popea is happy and singing. An audience at the time probably knew that just a few years later, Nero was prone to great fits, killed pregnant Popea. The audience, I would guess that a lot of the audience, I don't think there's any way to really know how much of it would have understood the extent to which Busanello was playing with history in the way was doing it. But I think it works extraordinarily.
And there are many operas you write about where you emphasize the fact that the meaning is really it's ambiguous, but the way in which thinking about politics and listening for a certain kind of politics behind it or political theory makes you understand the ambiguity much better, right? And why it's successful when it's successful. Let's see, we have two questions here. You, sir, and then you. And excuse me for pointing.
Reason why you stopped with Mozart, didn't go into that long 19th century of opera?
Yeah. When I first began the project, I actually had this crazy idea of going from the beginning, up through today, and trying to get it in its totality. But totality is always too big. What really marked off what I was doing was the notion that the ideas associated with modern politics, the modern state, are born of the Renaissance period. Opera born of the late Renaissance. The French Revolution is this gigantic crack-up of modern politics. And so that seemed to me to ended up being good bookends for something manageable. Manageable is still 450 pages. And I drift a little bit beyond because most people don't know that there were two parts to the Magic Flute, not written by Mozart. One, Schikaneder, his collaborator, wrote the a libretto. It's called The Labyrinth. It's not very good, but there's also a part two that was never set to music, written by a fellow named Goethe. Mm-hmm. And it's not Goethe's best, but it's still pretty interesting. But in any event, the real answer to your question is the emergence of modern politics in relationship to the crack-up of the French political world, and of course Mozart is a subject of the Habsburgs, and his king's sister is Marie Antoinette. So,
and
sorry.
Mm-hmm. And then we get volume 3 of Schoenberg and Adorno. Right. No, I'm just kidding. One more question, please.
The rise in opera corresponding in any way to the rise in literacy among people, and specifically, what percentage of the population in Italy at Monteverdi's time would have been capable of understanding?
I can't give you a specific answer to that, but very small. I can't guess the percentage, but very small. Certainly, a percentage going to the opera, although who knows how many coming for Carnival. But but really, it's the 16th century and the 17th century are centuries of great expansion of literacy. And he's relatively early. It's also with the development of middle classes, literacy, what's his name's book on the emergence of the book? We'll have more, his name is Fevre. Yeah, so I, right, okay. Yeah, he's written on population. Right. Right. Yeah. No, there's also a book. There's a book called The Coming of the Book.
Good. You get extra credit.
Yeah.
Let's-
I don't have.
If I may bring in like a sort of personal experience, the two things didn't necessarily go hand in hand, but for a certain period of time, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, actually opera made up for it. My great-grandfather, who was a basket weaver and was illiterate, but he sang in the chorus of the local opera company, and it was a small town of 5,000 people, and it had an opera. Basically, everybody was involved. Either played an instrument in the small orchestra, you were in the chorus. So he was illiterate, but he knew by heart the entire opera.
So this is the same way in which
That was
the
like-
Latin you knew came from learning it from the mass.
Exactly. But it had to
You
be
learned
learned.
that by heart, and then so you knew
But
that.
the difference is that very often you knew the Latin by heart, not knowing what the meaning was.
Exactly, sure.
But in this case, was that my great-grandfather that I never met knew exactly what he was thinking and was very aware of also the political
Exactly.
undertones of the opera, and that he was a product of that kind of education that he received through opera. So that we're identifying a certain patriotic idea, a certain proto-socialist idea that all transpired from the opera. So it was the living encyclopedia even of the literature.
Right.
What I tell my students all the time is that now you're used to think about people who go to the opera, wear a tuxedo, an evening gown, and a necklace. But at that time, it was really a popular show, not only in terms of fruition of the people who were in the audience, but of the people who actually made it possible on the stage. And yeah, not only he couldn't read the pentagram, he couldn't read the pentagram, but he knew them all. He would recite them and bring them up at the right time.
Charles Dickens has, in one of his descriptions of a visit to Italy, describes going to a little town of miners, and then you have a chorus of miners singing operas, operatic choruses. Yeah,
Where did they get the text?
don't know.
I mean, in a lot of
Don't
ways,
know.
we're talking about distribution.
Don't I don't.
Yeah.
Selling
Well, who knows if they were literate? That you learn. Someone teaches them.
you go down to the corner music school.
No, someone obviously teaches them.
You think they learned it by ear?
I don't know how they learned it.
So just,
I was just following up on Stefano's comment. It's interesting to think of opera as a communicator of political thought
Yeah.
and nationalism at a time when people who cannot read, as
Mhm.
the great artists of the Renaissance put up pictograms, literally like frescoes, to communicate theology that they also, most of the population couldn't understand or read. In any of, it would never be.
yeah, I suppose there's a billboarding effect, yeah, to a certain degree.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about these questions, although they're not quite exactly your focus, but there are copies of The Politics of Opera on sale in the lobby. And Mitchell, thank you very much. I really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
our conversation. Thank all of you. Thank you.